Hi, this is Aaron with HoyeTractor Parts. Today we're going to be replacing a starter solenoid on a Yanmar tractor starter. There's several different starters used on the Yanmar tractors, but they're all pretty much set up the same. Here are a few of the starter solenoids that are used on the Yanmar tractors. They all do the same thing. They're all set up about the same way. The only real difference is just the way that they attach to the starter. All of the solenoids are going to have the same 3 wires on the back. You have your one small terminal. That's going to go to your ignition switch. That's the wire that's going to be energized whenever you turn your key to the start position. Then you have 2 big terminals. You'll notice one of the big terminals has a small wire that goes into the starter solenoid. That's going to be the wire that you would attach to your starter itself. And then the other big terminal doesn't have anything hooked to it. That's going to go directly to your battery. The solenoid really serves 2 purposes. One, whenever you energize the small terminal by turning your key to the start position, it's going to pull in this plunger, which is going to move the starter drive gear into the flywheel. And at the same time, when this plunger moves all the way back, it's going to close these 2 terminals here. That's going to apply the power from your battery to turn the starter motor. And inside these starter solenoids, there's really 2 sets of coils. There's a high current coil and a low current coil. The high current coil's purpose is to pull the solenoid in. Then once it gets pulled in, it switches to the low current coil, and it's designed to hold the solenoid in the latched position. A lot of times when you burn up a solenoid, what's happening is there's something mechanical that's preventing the solenoid from reaching the latching position. If it doesn't reach the latched position, it stays in that high current mode and it will burn up really quickly. Alright, it's pretty straightforward to remove the solenoid from these starters. Basically, the first thing you want to do is remove the nut or loosen the nut that secures the wire from the solenoid to the starter. And then once you have the wire off, go ahead and remove the 2 bolts that hold the starter solenoid to the starter. Alright, and then when you go to pull your solenoid off, it's a good idea to look down in this little gap and kind of get yourself familiar with how the solenoid needs to attach to this little lever in here. It'll make putting it back together a lot easier. Alright, like I showed before, there's several different style solenoids. This is by far the most common that's used on the Yanmar tractors though. If you have this style, you're going to need to reuse this spring. It just snaps off and then you'll put it onto your new starter. Alright, probably one of the most common things that we see go wrong in a starter solenoid replacement is this little lever here gets unhooked from the starter drive. Once that gets unhooked, it really just flops around and it will never work right. What happens then is the starter solenoid is not able to work correctly. It's not able to pull all the way in and reach that low current latching mode, and it'll stay in the high current mode and it'll burn out really quick. If that ever does get unlatched, basically the only thing you can do is remove these 2 bolts and take the starter apart. And after you remove those 2 bolts, the starter should come apart pretty easy. Alright, and here's what you'll get when you pull that starter apart. This is the little fork that we're talking about. You can see the little fork fits on some little tabs here on this starter drive. And basically, you just want to hook this back up. It just slides on there. Just like that. Alright, while we have this starter apart, I thought it would be a good time to kind of show you how this all goes together. Basically, you can see this little notch in the fork. That's where your spring needs to sit. And then you also have this little tab. It needs to go into the little slot in the solenoid. You need to kind of just work it all to get down together, and it should go in there pretty easy. That's basically how that's going to sit once you get it up all together. You'll notice on this solenoid that there's 2 sets of holes that this spring can go in. Basically, you want to align the spring so that it's in line with these 2 mounting bolt holes. So this hole is in line with the 2 mounting bolt holes. You can see how if we use this other set of holes, the pivot point here is not in line with the 2 bolt holes. So we'll go over in this hole. Alright, and then one last thing before we put the new solenoid on. You see there's a little rubber gasket that's designed to seal the little gap between the front of the starter and this motor portion. Just stuff that in there, and then we're ready to install the new solenoid. Alright, and when installing the new solenoid, just make sure that the spring hooks down like that, and that the terminal for the starter is pointing up, and it should just kind of slide down in. Just kind of take your time. Make sure this lever is pulled all the way back as far as it'll go, and you should just be able to kind of guide it in there, and a little jiggling should go right down in there like that. You're going to be compressing this spring whenever you try to start these bolts, so it may be a little tough to get them lined up and going, but once you get them started, you can use the bolts to go ahead and draw the solenoid all the way up. Okay, I went ahead and tightened up the solenoid. Now it's time to attach the little wire to the starter. You want to make sure that the wire going to the starter is attached to the same terminal that already has that little wire made onto the solenoid. Go ahead and slide that on there and snug it up. You don't want to tighten this too tight because it's just a plastic end cap. If you torque down too tight on that, you'll just break this cap and you'll have to buy a new solenoid and do the whole thing over again. Alright, that should be it. Got the solenoid on, I just tested it, everything works great, and this starter should be ready to go back on the tractor.